so welcome back to this third module of our BizTalk tutorials. In this module, I'm going to talk a little bit about mapping inside BizTalk, or transformation, if you will. We use mapping a lot in BizTalk simply to transform from one XML document to another XML document using the standard language of Xslt. When working with BizTalk, a lot of the mapping can be done using a graphical mapper tool inside Visual Studio. But at the end of the day, all this mapping will be compiled into Xslt, meaning that if you are more comfortable with Xslt than using this graphical tool, you are allowed to just write Xslt directly. I will show you how this is done later in this module. In general, we will also have a small discussion about should I use the mapper or should I use Xslt, should I use a combination of the both? And as you probably guessed, that depends on a lot of things, so I will just try to clarify some of my thoughts about whether to use one over the other. So let's first look at a drawing just to summarize where inside a typical BizTalk flow our mapping is applied. Okay, so let's start by looking on where we actually apply mapping when using BizTalk. So if we have our classical BizTalk here with a receive port, a message box, and our send port, we got some orchestrations and so on and so on. I'm not going to go into details with it now. We did this in an earlier module. Receive port also contains of one to many receive locations. Now, in BizTalk in general, when talking about mapping, we apply mappings on receive ports, on send ports, and inside orchestration. So there's actually only 3 places where you can apply mappings. Receive port, orchestration, send ports. Now, as you've seen here, that I've drew more than one mapping on both receive ports and send ports. Now, in general, when working with BizTalk, the thing is that you will have a maximum of 1 map being applied for each message, either entering a receive port or a send port. It's simply like this. If you say, let's say we were mapping from A, B, C, and D to, I don't know, E. So what BizTalk would do in general when receiving a message is hopefully inside the pipeline here, it will recognize the message if we were using something else than just the pass-through receive. And let's say we were receiving a message B. What would happen here is that BizTalk would apply message, the second map shown here, and map B to E, and then it would be a message E that would go on and be submitted onto the message box. Now, only 1 map can be applied, a maximum of 1 map. It's quite okay that none maps are applied, meaning you are right now in this scenario here allowed to submit a message F. What will happen is just that BizTalk will say, well, do I have any maps where the source matches F? No, then F will just go directly to the message box. So you don't get an error if you applied maps and you receive messages that don't really, apply to any of the maps. That's fine in a BizTalk sense. Also, you need to be aware of that BizTalk will only apply 1 map. So let's imagine we had a 5th map here, if we can still see it, called E to G or something. Now in this case, if I submitted an A, this map here will be applied, so you would map from A to E, but you will not get this chain reaction of mapping or recursive thing or whatever you call it. So this map from E to G will not be applied, meaning if I submit an A message E will be submitted to the message box. If I, on the other hand, submit a message E, then this map will be applied and a message G would be submitted into the message box. And this of course also goes for the send port. So just to summarize up this short drawing here, we can apply maps 3 places: receive ports, send ports, and inside orchestrations. All right, so let's get back and look at some coding. So let's get some hands-on now. Let's actually do some coding and see how all this mapping works. So it's been a while since we did the first two modules, and now we've gone from I think a BizTalk 2010 to using a BizTalk 2016. So let's have a look here. I've made a new application called Course 3, and I'm going to build all this from scratch. So I think the first thing we will do is just create a very small XML document. Just call it input. And let's edit it in Notepad++, and let's just do, I don't know, a input. Give it some namespace. We talked about namespace in the last module, so let's just give it HTTP verticaldk/schemas version 1.0. And for now, let's just give it an ID and maybe some text. Blah, blah. All right, so that's pretty much it for now. Of course, I'm going to expand this later. Let's just open it up. Be sure that we actually has valid XML, which we do. So let's just create a small schema. Now, first of all, what you need to know, learn about mapping is that a map will need two schemas. It will need a source schema and a target schema. So let's just create a new Visual Studio project here. Name it Course 3, and let's create two schemas and a map. So actually, before doing that, let's actually just get a small flow up and running here. So if I just make a receive port called course3.receive and make a corresponding receive location, same name, just call it file. Let's just use a file adapter. And let's have that file adapter grab messages from this particular folder. And I'm going to do a little bit of cheating here and say just grab the file that contains the name copy. And from now, let's just leave all the default settings here. So just notice right now I'm just using a pass-through receive adapter, pipeline rather. Let's create one send port. Call it course 3 send. And let's filter on the receive port name here. And just set a file adapter pointing to the exact same folder I'm using for the input. And I'm just going to prefix it with something. All right. Now, let's start this application up and test if our application routing, the routing part at least, is working. So I copied it. I think it went so fast we didn't even see the copied message, but as you can see, it was processed by BizTalk, and BizTalk send port did throw out a replica actually of this XML. So let's imagine that one of our subscribers asked for some different XML than what we have to offer right now. In that case, we would need to do some mapping. We would need to say, well, okay, we got a, let's say it was an internal format of called input, and we wanted to map to maybe something called, well, you guessed it, output. So let's create both a schema for what we already have, namely our input sample I made just a minute ago, and also a schema for the target format, which would be the format that this particular send port or receiver asked for. Okay, so let's just create a new project here inside and just do an empty BizTalk project called Course 3. Like this. And let's create a couple of schemas. So I'm going to do an input schema here, which hopefully should correspond to whatever I did in this input file. So if I just open it up, maybe split my screen, we should be able to see here. Okay, so we definitely got a namespace here, which I thought I was going to copy paste. Yes. Like this. Sorry about that. Let's just see if we can. All right, so let's give this guy here, I'm just going to go full screen again. Let's give it target namespace here, and I'm going to make it element form default qualified. If you don't know exactly what these terms means, I suggest you watch my module 2, where I explain all this XML stuff going on inside schemas. Now let's name our root element input. And let us just once more just see what we got. We got 2 elements, one ID and one text. So let's actually do this. All right, so what I'm going to do here, I just want to validate that my schema actually conforms with the sample document I made here a minute ago. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, I think I'm going to rename, no, actually I don't need to rename it. So I'm just going to take this URL here, or path, a file path, if you will, and place it on my schema here as an input instance file name. And let's just see whether or not this actually validates. And it did. Good. So everybody's happy. So now what I can do is that I can create my output schema. I need to do it in this order because I won't be allowed to actually create a map before I have both schemas, both the input and the output. So let's just create an output schema. Just name it output. And let's make an output root element, and let's just call this output ID. And let's do something else, maybe a date, which we don't have in our input document. I'll get back to that later. And maybe this text thing here would be named description or something in our output. Also notice that our output do have a completely different namespace. I'm not really gonna change that right now. So now we got what we need in order to start creating our map. We got both a source called input and target called output schema. So without further ado, let's create this map. Call it input to output maybe. Now naming of these maps has a lot of different opinions from different BizTalk consultants, I guess. I like to use this _2, but you could also use the numeric 2, I guess, and a lot of other conventions. Just remember, it can't contain spaces, so we need some sort of underscore or whatever to keep track of what's actually going on. And I highly recommend you don't just call it map 1, which Visual Studio actually suggested for me. Also, please notice that it's very good practice to name this correctly before actually adding it to your Visual Studio project. Renaming BizTalk artifacts in general is not that easy. Some of them are doable, such as schemas and actually also maps, but when you come to orchestration and other things, it actually gets pretty complicated to get the name replaced all the places you need. So I would actually recommend you get the correct name to begin with. If you give it an incorrect name and need to change it, and you haven't done too much work on it, I would actually suggest you to just delete it and create a new one. All right. So let's add a map here, and as you can see, I get this kind of canvas thing here, and both to the left and right, I get this link that I am supposed to tell the map what source schema to use and tell the map what destination or target schema to use. So let's choose source schema. Let's get the input, and let's choose target or destination schema, and let's use the output. You can right click here and say expand everything. In my case, this is pretty simple, but in other cases you could have a more crazy hierarchical structure here. So I'm guessing that sometimes, extracting everything could actually create a lot of elements showing. So let's just, for now, just drag what we need to map. So I would like to map my ID to output ID, and I would like to map text to description. And that's sort of it for now. Now, if this is the case for the real mapping, then of course I should go to my output schema here and make date optional, since I'm not putting anything in date now. But I'm not going to do that right now, because later on I am actually going to fill something in that date element. So let's just see if what I've done so far is actually able to compile, and we get a build succeeded at the bottom here, so everything's good. Now, before we can deploy, I do need to strongly type sign my DLL in order for it to be installed in the global assembly cache, and all BizTalk assemblies do need to go into the global assembly cache. So I'm just going to choose an existing demo key here, and I'm also going to tell Visual Studio where to actually deploy my project, which I'm going to do in the application that I named course 3 back here. So I'm just going to write course 3. And when you do this, you've got to make sure you save manually, because sometimes tampering with these project properties actually don't save correctly inside Visual Studio. That's more of a Visual Studio thing than it is a BizTalk. So let me just try and deploy and see if everything goes as planned. Now, a good thing to do every time you actually deploy something in BizTalk is to restart all of your BizTalk host instances. It's actually not needed the first time you deploy a DLL, since BizTalk has not cached an existing version. Also, if you give all of your artifacts new .NET versioning numbers every time you deploy, it's also not needed, but you rarely do that, especially not in a developing life cycle. So I would suggest you just restart your host instances every time you deploy it directly from Visual Studio to make sure any changes that you applied will actually take effect immediately. So let's go and have a look here. If I refresh my administration console, we can see now I have a map called course 3 input to output. I also have a resource, which is my DLL. So in theory, a DLL can hold more than one artifact. In this case, it does. It also holds 2 schemas. So if I just applied this map, nothing will really happen, because as I showed you in the drawing before, we have to apply the map to either a receive port, a send port, or an orchestration. So in our case, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to apply it to my send port. So let's actually do that. So I'm going to go into my send port, and I'm going to choose Outbound Maps. And if I use this drop-down list, well, in my case, I'm only going to see one map. Per default, I'm only going to see the maps that are applied inside my own application here. And since I just started this application, I don't have anything else than this input to output. So I'm going to choose it. I'm going to choose Apply. And having done that, let's actually give it a test. So I'm going to give you a little bit heads up now. It's actually not going to work. And in a second, I'll show you why. So if I did this, you see we get a new file here, 1102. And if I open that, it's the exact same input file as we had already. Now, why is that? Well, it's actually because of something we did wrong in our receive location. It's actually because BizTalk has no idea what kind of message it's dealing with when it's using a pass-through receive adapter. If we want any map applied being on the receive or send side, BizTalk needs to know the message type. And it makes sense, right? Otherwise, how will it know what map to apply? I've already shown you that on a receive port and a send port, you can have multiple maps applied. So I'm going to choose an XML receive instead here. And if I do one more, submit here, hopefully, let's see, 1103. Hopefully you can see now we are getting some output, different namespace, and we get 10 in output ID, and we get blah blah here in subscription. So at least now our very premature, stupid small map is working. So let's actually dig a little bit more into what we can do with mapping now that it's working. I'm just going to make a small script here. I think I got it already that can remove all of my extra files here. Cool. So let's imagine that on our target document, there's actually a few fields here that we don't necessarily have in our source file. And that could be a date where we as a BizTalk consultant will go and say, hey, these guy needs a date, but I don't have them on the document coming in, so what do I do? And most likely they will say, just put in today's date or something. And this is where we introduce something called functoids. When working in this graphical mapping tool, Microsoft has given us a lot of different shapes, as you can see here, or small squares that we can actually drag into this canvas thing and use. And one of them is date, which will just give us return the current date as is shown in this tooltip. So if I just drag in a date like this and apply, this should actually work. Now I'm also just going to talk briefly about another feature when again working with this more graphical mapping thing here. You can split, because you can probably imagine that if we had like 50 or 100 different elements on both the incoming and outgoing schemas, this graphical thing here could get pretty complicated. So we are able to add additional pages and have different part of the mapping being done on different pages. So if I said, hey, all of my date stuff, I'm not sure this example is the best in the world, but never mind. All of the date stuff should actually happen in the date tab. Then let's just delete this guy here and go and drag the date into another tab. And you can see here now that I've sort of divided some of my complexity into different pages simply for a better visual understanding of what's going on. And you can actually also see here that it will tell us, even though we're not on the date tab, that the date has been mapped. You see the small lock chain thing here on your target element. That means, hey, something has happened to this element, which is can be a very nice overview sometimes. So let's try and deploy this guy here again. And as soon as we are being told it was successful, we should restart our service. And having done that, hopefully we are able to submit a new message. And as you can see here, we have actually inserted today's date in this field using a standard functoid. All right, so let's do something a little bit more complex then. What are we going to do here? We are going to, still it's somewhat simple, but let's actually add quantity or something here. And the quantity should be a number or something. Could be decimal, could be, integer, but let's just do decimal. And on the send side, let's do something else. Let's actually have a Boolean or something called heavy. Again, this might be a stupid example when we come to real life example, but this is merely to show how some logic can be applied to our mapping in BizTalk. So let's imagine the customer says, if quantity is above 100, then I want heavy to say true, otherwise false, for instance. So first of all, I am going to expand my sample document with this quantity thing here. And let's just do a 300 for now. Probably gonna need a few more samples. Let's actually call this input heavy. And let's make an additional copy. And for me to be able to do that, I need to temporarily disable my receive location. Otherwise, the receive location will grab the message immediately. So let's just make a input light here. And let's change quantity to 30 in this document. Let me just be sure that it's still valid XML. Yes, everything's good. So let's assume that this schema here now, our input schema, still conforms with our sample document just by validating it. Something has changed, and it did not. And why is that? Actually, I think it did. It was something else. So quantity. I think the problem is, I know what the problem is, I'm sorry. I actually lost this file just named input, right? So I'm going to do an input light. I believe it was called, so let's validate it. And everything validates perfect. All right, so let's actually implement some of this logic we talked about in our map now. So I'm going to need to refresh this map. I'm probably going to need to rebuild everything first of all. Having done that, I should be able to open my map again, and now I will see the newly added elements. So what was the thing they said? They said, okay, let's put in a true if quantity is above 100. Otherwise, let's write false in heavy. So I need a couple of functoids here. The first thing I'm going to do is that I'm going to use a greater than functoid, where the first parameter input will be my quantity. Now the second parameter here will just be a hard-coded 100. So this guy here will either return true or false. It will return true if we're dealing with an input document where quantity is above 100, and it will return false in all other cases. So having used this, what I can do is that I can use something called a value mapper, value mapping actually. Now a value mapper, you can actually go here and read a little bit about all your functoids. So what the value mapper says is that it's going to need two different input parameters, one of them being a Boolean. So we have to first supply it with a Boolean that's either true or false, hence Boolean. And if our Boolean is true, then we will take whatever value is in the second parameter, namely the result here, and map to the field in the target document where we are actually applying this value mapping functoid to. So let's try that. So let's say our first parameter in this case is our greater than, which we already talked about, will return a Boolean, right? And the second parameter for now will just be a hard-coded true. I can actually never remember whether or not these Boolean things are capitalized, but let's just consider them as a string for the moment. So what I can do here is I can drag this guy to heavy. So let's just for now, I know I haven't really completed because we also wanted a false in case it wasn't a heavy thing, you know, if quantity weren't above 100. But let me just test this now. So my input document right now is, no, I'm actually not using any input document. Let's actually go and set up an input document. I'm going to use this light document first. And I'm going to go to my mapper here. And I'm going to choose my test input should be XML. It should not be generated by Visual Studio. I'm going to use this physical file here on my hard drive. And I think now it will actually work, but I will recommend you guys when you're actually, while you're developing your maps, you might need to set these properties down here, whether or not the actual schema should also be validated to false just temporarily. Whenever your map is finished, of course, these should be set to true again, and you should actually see that you are conforming with your schema standard when mapping, especially on the target format, right? But for now, let's just set them to false, just because we are still in working mode. So let's go and test our map. And we can see here that we don't get any heavy right now. But hopefully, if we change our sample document to the heavy document, then what we should be able to see is that now we do get this heavy true. So let's actually fix this else condition where, hey, if it's not above 100, then just put in false. Now, first of all, there's no if-else functoid really present here in the mapper, so we will have to do a little bit of magic, I guess. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to introduce a logical not shape, which will, toggle or twist your Boolean. So whenever you supply it with the true, it's going to return false and vice versa. So in this case, I will be able to reverse, my condition greater than 100. So this will be sort of an else case. And I will also introduce a second value mapping where I will hard code false. And I'm going to drag it to the same output element, namely heavy here. And let me just build everything. So I'm supposed to see now, I'm still pointing at my sample document heavy here. So I will probably, we already saw this working before, but let's just test that we get heavy true. And now if I switch to my light, hopefully I would be able to see heavy equals false. Okay, so everything's working. We've done what the customer asked for. However, now this is a very stupid, simple example. You can probably imagine that if we had a lot of business logic and we had a lot of elements and so on, these functoids and the graphical representation of them could become somewhat complex and not very readable. And this is where we might start to consider introducing writing our own Xslt. But whether or not we should even consider going there, I think depends on a few situations. First of all, if we don't have anybody that knows Xslt, well, I guess then the answer is pretty obvious, right? We shouldn't really go down that path. Because I don't think Xslt it's a pretty steep learning curve, I would say. On the other hand, there's actually not that many different functions or methods inside Xslt, so it's sort of it's sort of limited what we have to learn. But some of the things, writing your own XPath expressions that might need some conditions and stuff, they do have a sort of a steep learning curve. But I'm going to just try and introduce you to it in a second. Let's first of all take our existing map here and deploy it. So once again, restart our service, delete any existing documents, and hopefully we should see, now let's actually submit both a light and a heavy. And if I do that, hopefully I will get, right, I disabled my receive location before. So let's actually enable that again. Now I get two documents here. So one is heavy false and the other one is heavy true. Perfect, everything is working. So let's imagine we said, well, this is probably going to get more complicated and so on. I think I want to switch to writing my own Xslt instead of using the mapper. Let's actually see how it's done. Now, in case you want to write your own Xslt, you need to realize or know a few things. First of all, as soon as we switch from the mapper to custom Xslt, you're sort of on your own. The mapper does a lot of work for you. You saw before that I could go in and change our existing schemas, and once I reloaded the mapper, those new elements were present. Also, you can actually change the namespace on one of the schemas, and you might lose some of your links, but the mapper will conform with these changes, and the next time you rebuild your mapping, all these changes will apply. As soon as you switch to custom Xslt, like I said, you're on your own. You will need to make all of those changes, a different namespace, a new element, an element that changed the name, whatever. You will need to make all of those changes inside your Xslt yourself. So that's sort of the disadvantage. The advantage is, I would say, two things. You are able to do much more if, again, you know XSLT. And also, as you will see, if you actually try to generate XSLT code through some of your existing maps that are using the mapper, you will see that it's not always the most optimal XSLT being created from the mapper. And of course, if you are an XSLT expert, you will be able to make a much better XSLT performance-wise, text-wise, doing it yourself. Let me actually show you that. If I right-click on my existing map here that we are using today, no XSLT, we're just using our mapper. If I right-click and say validate map instead of test map, then Visual Studio actually gives me a sample of the XSLT being generated. And if you just scroll down here real quickly, you can see that's a lot of coding for something I would say was rather simple. So I'm not good at counting here, but let's just say that there was 100, that's maybe too much, 70 lines or something right now in this document. Now what I'm going to show you is that using XSLT, I think we can get this down to, I don't know, 10 lines of code or something, doing the exact same thing. So let's do that. So what I'm going to do a couple of things here and try to follow along, but I will explain what I'm doing, and not all of the things really needs to be done, but again, I will keep you informed of what's going on. So the first thing I'm going to do is that I'm just going to copy paste this existing XSLT here. Now I don't really want to reuse too much of it, but as you can see, there's a lot of stuff going on here, a lot of enveloping stuff going on at the top of my XSLT that complies with these two schemas, and I don't want to have to rewrite that again. I'm also going to add this XSLT into my project. Now this is not needed in order for the XSLT to work once we compile it. This is merely so that I can easily manipulate it inside Visual Studio. In order for the map to actually use this XSLT instead of using my graphical mapper is the fact that if I go into my mapper here and click anywhere here on the free canvas, you can see there's actually a property called custom XSLT path. As soon as I set my custom XSLT path, this XSLT will be used instead of whatever is on the mapper. And that's also pretty important to notice here, because there might be stuff on the mapper, but as soon as you've set this property, it will totally be ignored. Okay, so actually let's go and find this map here. If I go to, I think it was temp somewhere I put it. Temp, no it wasn't, just a second. I just need to see where I placed. Okay, VS temp. Okay, so let me again go and set this custom XSLT path. So back to C, VS temp. Course 3, and here you have it. So now once this is pointing to my XSLT, this is what will be used. And please again bear in mind, I didn't really have to include this XSLT in the project. It's just for my convenience in order to change it. So let's go and test this. So let's get rid of a lot of this stuff. So let's actually think here. We will need some, I think we will need one of the C# things down here, which is the current date. So the current date we cannot do without some C# coding, but the rest of all this C# coding here is obsolete. So let me get rid of that. I want to show you how we can do this without all this C# code. So let's just stick with just one small method inside of our C# code, and let's also get rid of all of this. So let me just do it in small steps here. I need to get rid of these variables, and I want to get rid of everything right now that's inside of my output. Okay. So just to test just to test that it's actually the XSLT being used now and not the actual mapper. I'm just going to write a stupid tag here called A or something. So if I do that and I try to test my map, hopefully what I will see in my output is just an A, which means yes, now it's the XSLT we're using and not the mapper. And again, please bear in mind that if I look at my map, I still have all these icons here. So of course, in the perfect world, you probably should get rid of these things here once you start using custom XSLT, just not to confuse people. And let's do that actually. So let's do a couple of things here. Let's just prettify this a little bit so you can see what all the fuss is about. I'm going to do some of my namespaces here. Now there are two pretty important namespaces, namely these two here, where you can see that our source document namespace is prefixed S0 and our target namespace is prefixed NS0. And you can you can change these if you want to. I'm just going to leave them for now. But you can also see here what's happening is that I'm starting by matching. I'm saying, hey, with this source namespace, you need to find me an element called input, which happens to be our root element. And from there on, we're going to start by creating our output document using the target namespace here. Now from here on, because you might remember that our output was not element qualified, it was actually element unqualified, which means in the output, we don't have the namespace on all of these children elements. So instead of writing NS0 ID here, I should just write ID. Now once I've done that, I need to retrieve a value from our source document. Now to do that, I just write XML value of select. Now this gets interesting because now I need to, let's actually open one of our source documents here. I need to retrieve this value here named ID. Now ID is a child of input, but my cursor is already pointing at input since I'm inside a template that's matching input. So all I have to do now is just say S0. Remember, our source document was element qualified, which means that this namespace here is being derived to all of the children elements. So ID also contains this element. Oh, this namespace rather. So I'm going to write S0:ID. And hopefully, let's just test this to make sure we're on the right path. And as you can see here, I retrieved this. Perfect. So what was the next element? That was, well, I have to look at the output, don't I? So that was the date thing. Let's do the date thing. So I'm going to do a date here. And in order for us to call something inside our custom C# code, we need to prefix it with user C#, which is defined up here. So I'm just going to do a user C# colon and then the name of my method. And I think I have to do this because it is actually possible also to pass parameters to these C# functions. So let's see if this is working. Perfect. Now we got our date working, and then we're just going to do that description. Remember, the description came from a field in the source document named text. So I'm just going to copy paste. You're going to do, if you write XSLT, you're going to do a lot of copy pasting. All right, so let's do text here. Yes, and now for the final. I will have to do this field. Remember this business logic from quantity to heavy was where we had to do like 3 or 4 different functoids and a lot of dragging lines and stuff. And let's actually see how we would do that in pure XSLT. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, well, I know I'm going to have a field called heavy, right? I think so. Yes, this was our output. Perfect. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a choose, which is sort of equivalent. If you guys know any .NET, it would be, or other languages like Java, it would be equivalent to a switch, I guess. And we can do a when test. So I'm going to do if my S0 quantity is greater than 100. If that's the case, then I'm going to do an XSL text true. And we could have more whens, again, just like a switch, you know, you could do more than one. And then you can have sort of like your default is your otherwise down here. And I'm going to do an XSL text here called false. So let me just test this. Yeah, we got a false here, and I'm pretty sure, I hope, we were using the light, which we were. So let's just switch to the heavy sample document here. And hopefully it's true now. Perfect. So this was just a small introduction into mapping in BizTalk. I'm not right now going to show you all of the functoids being used, but I hope it gave you an idea of, first of all, how to use mapping in BizTalk. And more importantly, the switch between using a regular map and using custom XSLT. Now, personally, I would probably stick to the mapper as long as possible, but I would never, really try and tweak those functoids. I should also mention you can write your own functoid and deploy them actually through .NET code. But again, also you need to take into consideration, do I even know anybody who knows XSLT? Because you need to know XSLT, of course, to switch to custom XSLT. But if you do that, remember you have to do all of your cleaning up of changes in the maps yourself, but you are given a lot of freedom if, again, you know XSLT. So I think that was it for this module 3 of our BizTalk course. Thank you so much.